In my last video, I talked about The Wizard of Oz, a work of art so beloved that it overshadowed the horrifying gauntlet of trauma endured by its cast and crew. The studio behind the film was MGM, a company that for generations single-handedly carried the film industry on its back. Decades later, you could have said the same thing about Nintendo and the video game industry. In 1983, the US video game market crashed. In just 2 years, industry revenue had plummeted by more than 95%. Atari, the leading American games manufacturer, was forced to bury more than 700,000 unsold cartridges in a New Mexico landfill. The state of the video game industry was in shambles, providing ample opportunity for one Japanese company to pick up the pieces.
Super Mario Bros. 新発売
In 1985, Nintendo released the NES in the United States, a console that rejuvenated consumer confidence in gaming. In its darkest hour, the video game industry was rescued by a mystical company from a faraway land. Many fans of gaming have come to see it as a miracle. By 1988, the NES accounted for a 70% share of the video game market, and the industry was poised for its most prosperous period yet. Nintendo inherited the exalted title the savior of video games. Now, nearly 40 years and 6 consoles later, the warship is far from over.
Come on!
But where are we going?
To Neverland.
Neverland.
You'll never grow up there.
Modern-day disciples of Nintendo span a variety of denominations. Together, they form one of the most loyal followings for any brand in the world. However, despite the daily outpouring of reverence and adoration Nintendo receives from its fans, the sentiment is far from mutual. Recently, it's been quite the opposite. In fact, the past 20 years have shown us that Nintendo's most passionate supporters often wind up becoming their most forsaken. Last year, I posted a video about Hungrybox and competitive Melee. It's a video that features many layers of conflict, one of which was Nintendo's antagonistic relationship with competitive Smash. Super Smash Bros. Was never designed to be anything other than a party game, but developer intentions wouldn't stop some players from reinventing the game in their own vision. The rushed development of Melee led to a series of engine exploits which pushed the skill ceiling of the game to the limits of human ability.
But it was so frame perfect, I felt like literally an explosion in my hand.
These unique mechanics transformed the game into a competitive spectacle, and one of the first video games in America showcased and sanctioned esports tournaments. MLG hosted Melee tournaments as far back as 2004, predating even the earliest Call of Duty championships. At the time, the esports industry was still in its infancy, and Super Smash Bros. Was in prime position to lead competitive gaming into a new era. Unfortunately, Nintendo wasn't on board with the idea of their game being played competitively at all. Lead developer Masahiro Sakurai made it his mission to all but erase competitive play in the next installment of the series.
No contest!
Melee's defining mechanics were neutered, if not outright removed, in its sequel. A deliberate design decision by the developers who feared that Melee's competitiveness was intimidating new players. Considering that Melee was the best-selling game on its system, it's tough to justify that wave dashing had any effect on casual players' reception towards the franchise. Across all of gaming, it's very unusual for the skill ceiling of a game to actually affect the enjoyment of new players. Even games as simple as Tetris and chess see highly competitive top players utilizing extremely advanced strategy, yet they remain 2 of the most played games in history. In Melee, the competitive community at the time only represented a minuscule fraction of the total players, and it's very likely that the vast majority of Nintendo's customers didn't even know they existed. The company's insistence on specifically punishing competitive play is truly bizarre, and possibly unprecedented among the entire industry. In the end though, dynamic and nuanced play was sacrificed to appease the casual player base who in all likelihood would have still enjoyed the game regardless. Removing competitive techniques from future titles is one thing, but deliberately sabotaging competitors from enjoying an existing game is a whole other level of petty. MLG's original run with Melee ended after 2006, but it was originally supposed to continue into 2007 and beyond. The organization was allegedly pressured by Nintendo to drop Melee from its pro circuit so as to not interfere with the release of Brawl. While other esports at the time were beginning to prosper, competitive Melee was subject to a dark age that would persist until 2013, when the community raised enough money to earn a spot at EVO. Of course, Nintendo infamously tried to revoke EVO's rights to stream the event, a decision so unpopular that they were forced to back down less than 24 hours later. This incident has been heavily publicized, but it wasn't the first time Nintendo tried to black out a Smash tournament. In 2010, MLG hosted their one and only tournament for Brawl, a tournament that was never seen by anyone outside of the venue. Nintendo refused to allow MLG to stream the event, and unlike the case with Melee a few years later, Brawl's stream was never reinstated. Nintendo's contempt for competitive play is something not seen by practically any other big-name game developer. It's common practice in the industry today for developers to bankroll big tournament pots, because it's fairly well understood that a healthy competitive scene contributes to a more engaging product for all players. While competitors in most esports bask in $100,000 prize pools, Smash players have to act graciously for simply being allowed to play at all. Nintendo is not just indifferent to competitive Smash, oftentimes they are actively malicious. 2013 saw the release of Project M, a modded version of Brawl which combined its existing roster with Melee's mechanics. Over the next couple of years, Project M tournaments grew in popularity to be on par with Melee in viewership and attendance. Then, at the end of 2015, the mod was suddenly and mysteriously abandoned by both developers and tournament organizers. Years later, it was revealed that at the time, Nintendo was toying around with sponsoring an official competitive circuit, but mandated that Project M be discarded before moving forward. Despite support from major entities like Twitch and Red Bull, Nintendo strung the community along for 3 years before dumping the prospect altogether upon the release of Smash Ultimate. Smash would never end up getting an official pro circuit, and Project M was sacrificed for nothing. By the beginning of 2020, the Smash community had finally secured enough funds to arrange their own competitive circuit independent of Nintendo. But well, some things are just never meant to work out. Even amidst the depths of the pandemic, the passion for competitive Smash still persisted through online tournaments, but even then, Nintendo had to rear its head and punish a community who had everything else taken from them. The Big House 2020 was cancelled because online play necessitated the use of a modded version of Melee run on an emulator. And so, the players of Melee were stripped of their last solitary means of competition.
What more can you take away from me?
The Smash community is generally not well liked by the majority of observers. Last year's firestorm of allegations and controversy among top community figures certainly didn't help. The public's perception of the esport has likely been tarnished beyond repair, and many people remain adamantly unsympathetic over the plight of competitive Smash. However, understanding Nintendo's treatment of its esports competitors provides us with insight into how they tend to respond to any conflict of interest with their fans. Even back in the days of MLG, what Nintendo did to the Smash community set the tone for how they would treat their most die-hard supporters moving forward. As time marches on, video game hardware gradually degrades and stops functioning. Among would-be players, hardware deterioration creates an issue of accessibility. For many, the solution to this issue lies in emulation, and no company despises emulation more than Nintendo.
This is illegal, you know.
There's a prevailing misconception among the general public that emulating games in and of itself is illegal. However, a series of court decisions during the 90s and early 2000s ruled that the act of emulation is totally permissible by law, upholding that video game companies are not entitled to a monopoly. Where the legal issues arise is the distribution of digital game files, which does fall into the realm of copyright infringement. The YouTuber Nero made a trilogy of videos discussing everything you need to know about emulation, which I highly recommend watching in order to gain a full understanding of the situation. But to summarize, a substantial portion of ROM sharing is done so out of necessity, by people who have no other means of obtaining games through legitimate methods. Obscurity, rights issues, and region locking make some titles remarkably difficult to acquire. When consumers are willing and able to pay for a product, it's up to existing services to fulfill those needs. When services fail to offer desired products, consumers have no choice but to obtain them through piracy or other black market means. Most game companies understand this and offer ample opportunity for consumers to easily experience retro titles. Nintendo, on the other hand, despite being the most adamantly outspoken about emulation as theft, is noticeably lacking in providing any legal alternative to many of their titles. Nintendo's online retro libraries release games at a snail's pace, and by the time a console reaches the end of its lifespan, its existing library becomes unavailable, forcing consumers to restart their digital collection on the following system. This process creates sizable lapse periods where would-be customers are unable to access their favorite retro games. Even Nintendo's dedicated retro hardware like the NES Classic suffered notorious supply shortages. Many have inferred that restricting their supply of classic games is a deliberate strategy by Nintendo to artificially drive up demand. To make matters worse, Nintendo's official retro experience tends to lack many of the basic features that were available on emulators as far back as the 90s. Perhaps if the company spent as much effort improving their own retro offerings as they do litigating the passionate fans who make better alternatives, there wouldn't be as much of an underground market to litigate. Market is not even an accurate term, considering how practically all ROMs and emulators are distributed with no intention of earning revenue. But that doesn't stop Nintendo from suing many of these people for millions of dollars that they never made. It's widely understood among copyright experts that ROM libraries such as console classics are perfectly legal, since they lend out a limited supply of ROMs that each correspond to a physical copy that they own. However, despite taking every precaution they could, console classics still had to deal with Nintendo's bullying and intimidation. The Emularity Games library notably excludes Nintendo games from their collection because of the company's cutthroat reputation. The exclusion serves as a stark reminder of how in the present day, Nintendo is the only major game company belligerent enough to continue punishing emulation. And yes, Nintendo has the legal right to do so, just like how music companies have the legal right to ruin someone's life for downloading some songs off the internet. Longtime viewers of the channel know exactly what I think about the utter nonsense that is modern copyright legislation, so if you want to convince me of Nintendo's righteous virtue in this situation, you're gonna have to justify it with something a bit more compelling than
That's how the law works.
where Nintendo starts to enter truly egregious territories through its treatment of mods and fan games. I've already talked about the tragic downfall of Project M, but that was simply a drop in the bucket compared to the immense scale of Nintendo's warpath against fan-made projects. In 2016, Nintendo issued cease and desist on over 500 fan games, 2 of which included the highly anticipated Pokemon Uranium and AM2R. Both of these projects represented a labor of love that took developers thousands of hours of their own free time to complete, and Nintendo's response to all of that effort and talent was to stomp it into the dust. It may be tough to understand why Nintendo is so ruthless about guarding their intellectual property, but the answer can be found in the company's history. Back in the 80s, Nintendo made it their mission to undo the industry mistakes which led to the crash. Consumers had lost faith in video games because the market had become flooded with low-quality cash grabs and bootlegs. Nintendo implemented their seal of quality as a necessary measure for consumers to distinguish their quality products from cheap knockoffs. Today, the industry has vastly changed, but Nintendo's primal fear of rogue imitators has never left them. It's a fear that can now be described as irrational and detrimental to the industry as a whole. Video games have long since surpassed film and music as the biggest entertainment industry in the world. Suffice to say, the gaming industry is no longer teetering on the brink of outright collapse from some teenager making a ROM hack. Since Nintendo's heyday, modding and fan-made adaptations have actually contributed to some of the most celebrated games of all time. Valve built their entire game library off a modded version of the Quake engine. Developer John Carmack released the source code for anyone to use, the fruits of which resulted in some of the most influential games of their era. Today, Valve has repaid the favor to the next generation of programmers who are allowed to buy and sell modded Valve games on their own platform. These days, it's safe to say that modding is not just an accepted part of the industry, but a necessity in innovating the genre as a whole. If John Carmack acted like Nintendo, the gaming industry would have been set back by years. It's relatively rare for modern game companies to police fans creating mods of their games, but it's nearly unthinkable for companies to police fans creating videos of their games. So have you ever noticed how most Nintendo YouTubers only seem to start popping into existence about 4 years ago? Well, there's a very important reason for that, because in the early 2010s, being a Nintendo YouTuber was completely infeasible. Last year, Google Stadia creative director Alex Hutchinson posted a tweet suggesting that streamers and content creators pay a fee to game publishers for the privilege of having others watch them play. This post got absolutely ratioed out of the ballpark. I mean, really, what a totally asinine statement. Can you actually imagine how dystopian it would be if companies actually did this? Except, one company has done this, Nintendo. At one point, it was actually worse than even what this guy suggested. In 2013, Nintendo Content ID claimed all footage of their games on YouTube. If you used even a fraction of Nintendo gameplay, that video wouldn't earn you a dime. It turns out that punishing everyone who makes videos about your games is a good way to ensure that no one makes videos about your games. As YouTube Let's Plays exploded in popularity at around the same time, Nintendo began to realize that their decision was costing them millions in potential free advertising. So in 2015, they sheepishly restored content creators' ability to earn revenue, this time taking a 30% cut. However, in order to get your 70% share, you were forced to manually apply to their partner program so they could micromanage your channel and make sure that you didn't step out of line from their standards. This policy persisted for more than 3 years before Nintendo finally scrapped it and allowed content creators to do what literally every other game publisher was fine with the whole time. Nintendo is such an utterly baffling company to me because the hard part of running a game studio comes so easy to them. They can pump out masterpiece after masterpiece without breaking a sweat. As far as I can tell, they treat their employees quite well. It's just the simple no-brainer public relations tasks that seem to utterly escape them. If EA or Blizzard or Sony or Epic Games did just some of the things Nintendo do on a regular basis, you'd never hear the end of it. What makes Nintendo any different? How do they keep getting away with it? Well, the main difference between Nintendo and all of these other companies comes down to one factor: the fans.
Go back and grow up. But I'm warning you, once you're grown up, you can never come back.
I understand that for some people, Nintendo is more than just some company that makes good games. Whole generations of people grew up with them. Many saw Nintendo as a defining part of their childhood, and have absorbed the company and its characters as an integral piece of their identity. For some, Nintendo evokes profound nostalgia for simpler, happier days. For others, it represents a refuge from the abuse and torment of their reality. You'd be hard-pressed to find any other brand that can summon such powerful feelings of vulnerable, youthful innocence. I'm not here to disparage people for being passionate about something they truly and unabashedly love, but recognizing the zealous loyalty of the Nintendo fanbase is a necessary step in diagnosing the problem.
Ha ha! Here's the problem.
After 40 years of making such beloved games, Nintendo has spawned a following of apostles who worship the company with religious dedication. It's not enough for them to simply engage with the products. The most devout Nintendo fans have an obligation to make their faith known to all who encounter them. Such ardent loyalty to some faraway corporation is highly abnormal, and it leads to highly abnormal outcomes. Nintendo is certainly aware of the immense goodwill which their customers share, and rather than reciprocate it, they have harnessed it, and are currently riding it all the way to the bank. They're confident that they can get away with almost anything, because a substantial portion of their audience have adopted the dogmatic belief that the company is incapable of sin. Recently, there have been prevailing discussions online about the toxicity of fandoms and stan culture. And while the same few notorious subcultures get brought up over and over again, I rarely see anyone mention the Nintendo fandom in these conversations. In my experience, the most extreme Nintendo fans are as psychotic and maladjusted as any other fandom, and I'm tired of pretending that they're not. I always imagine that Nintendo doesn't have to pay a PR team to run damage control because their fans will do it for them. It seems that no matter how low the company stoops, it will always have a human shield of fanboys lining up to make excuses for them. The most diehard fans are so quick to forget about the company's misdeeds that you'd think they have amnesia. At the end of last year, Nintendo got into some hot water. In the span of a few weeks, they shut down Melee's biggest online event, shut down a Splatoon tournament when those players stood in solidarity with the Melee players, and shut down the charitable sale of Joy-Cons honoring the late Etika. 3 days later, they unveiled Sephiroth in Ultimate, and all the backlash magically disappeared. When I pointed this out on Twitter, I spent the next week getting bombarded with apoplectic responses of how much of an idiot I was for thinking that Nintendo fans would actually express displeasure to the company. Wow, what an awful take. How foolish of me. When have people ever protested a company's recent actions by pressing dislike on their totally unrelated YouTube videos?
Well, actually...
October 2019, Blizzard bans Hearthstone player Blitzchung for making pro-Hong Kong comments. Their subsequent unrelated YouTube videos are heavily disliked. November 2018, Fallout 76 launches as a buggy, unplayable disaster. Bethesda gets ratioed on unrelated videos. November 2017, EA reveals much-hated loot crates will be a part of Battlefront 2. Ratio. August 2016, No Man's Sky grossly underdelivers upon release. Ratio. Now where did I get this absolutely bonkers idea again?
This baby is off the charts.
I was never trying to argue that spamming dislikes on developer videos is an effective means of instigating change. I'm not even arguing that it's justifiable. My point with all of this was that ratioing videos is a simple and direct way for consumers to publicly express their disapproval towards a company. And recent history shows us that this is the natural response to controversy in the gaming industry. The notable absence of dislikes on Nintendo's video after the controversy says to me that the backlash never really existed. All that hemming and hawing in the moment was superficial and couldn't have reflected anyone's true convictions. Because the second Nintendo jangled a shiny set of keys in front of the fans, everyone seemed to forgive and forget. The Nintendo Brigade was quick to jump down my throat to lecture me about how a video posted to Nintendo's YouTube channel featuring a best-selling Nintendo franchise somehow exists irrespective to Nintendo as a business. Many tried to make the complete non-sequitur argument that disliking a YouTube video is somehow equivalent to taking food off of Sakurai's dinner plate, with one person comparing Sakurai to a hapless Walmart employee.
Okay, so that's how it's gonna be. Y'all wanna play.
Ignoring the fact that this post isn't even directed at Sakurai, trying to frame him as an independent bystander to the big bad legal team above him is painfully naive and factually wrong. So many people try to compartmentalize all of Nintendo's nasty practices as the work of just a few dastardly lawyers, in a desperate attempt to salvage the company's spotless image in their minds. This may come off as a newsflash to some of you, but every corporation has a legal department. Every corporation is confronted with threats to their intellectual property. Very few corporations choose to respond to these problems as viciously as Nintendo. Very few companies use mafioso tactics to harass and intimidate people who wound up on the wrong side of their terms of service. Very few companies rig their country's legal system to threaten video game modders with jail time. Nintendo is starting to resemble a tyrant that's gone mad with power, and their draconian disregard for the public good runs a hell of a lot deeper than a couple of bad apples on their legal team. Every decision any company makes comes straight from the top, and as hard as it may be for some of you to believe, Sakurai is a hell of a lot closer to the top than the alternative. Lots of people try to obfuscate his role in the company by stipulating that he is not technically a Nintendo employee. This point is completely irrelevant when you consider how Sakurai's actions directly influenced the bottom line of the company, and how his entire career trajectory was dictated by Nintendo's success. He is the spokesperson for Super Smash Bros. By definition, he represents the views of the company.
Hello?
Just like those oh-so-nefarious lawyers, it is his job to toe the company line. He oversaw two of Nintendo's flagship franchises for decades. He had the opportunity to make Smash better for competitive players, and he didn't. He had the opportunity to speak out against Nintendo's increasingly slimy business decisions, and he didn't. To claim in any way that Sakurai somehow exists in a vacuum, completely free of Nintendo's influence, demonstrates a complete ignorance towards the nature of business. But hey, who am I to dare commit sacrilege against one of Nintendo's prodigal sons? If Nintendo is God, Sakurai and all their other spokespeople are Jesus Christ, and have been idolized as such. You're not allowed to criticize them, and you're especially not allowed to undermine their supreme authority. When Nintendo does all that anti-consumer stuff, they're just operating within their fair and justifiable legal right. But pressing dislike on a Sakurai video? Now that's just cruel. Who would even consider doing such a thing? 11 months before this, the Nintendo fandom actually decided to make use of the dislike button to protest the addition of Byleth to Smash Ultimate, and they didn't seem to be too concerned over Sakurai's feelings here. Blatant double standards aside, it's somewhat enlightening to realize where the Nintendo fandom's priorities actually lie. Complaining about an optional DLC sword fighter in a game with 80 other characters. I can't help but think that some of these people exist in Neverland. Tangible problems in our world don't concern them. Only when their whimsical wonderland is disrupted do they show the slightest signs of resistance. Fortunately for Nintendo, pacifying the mob is as simple as unveiling the next shiny new toy. And therein lies the ultimate problem. There was once a time where enough people would object to Nintendo's decisions and the company could actually be convinced to listen. Now we've reached a point where the militant worship of the company is drowning out dissenting voices in practically all cases of controversy. All of us are left to reap the consequences of a company who knows their audience will tolerate anything they do as long as the product on screen is good enough. They can charge $20 a year for a barely functional online service that was free on prior systems. They can charge $80 for controllers with such significant defects that they make many games borderline unplayable. They can release reskins of games that cost more than the originals. They can arbitrarily limit the release window of games for no other reason than to jack up the price. They can force customers to purchase an additional console if they want to create a second island in Animal Crossing. At what point will Nintendo cross the line to where the customer is no longer willing to get ripped off? Fortunately, Nintendo has the most loyal fans in the world, and that line is nowhere in sight.
I will still buy shit from them. I couldn't give less of a crap to the free Melee thing.
That's the problem! You don't give a damn! And my problem is I care too much!
Also, what the hell you are calling Nintendo consumers pathetic? Am I pathetic for having a Switch?
Yes.
In the Church of Nintendo, the most adoring followers make the best sacrifices, and as time goes on, the untouchable deity only grows more hungry. The sad reality is that the solution to Nintendo's problems rests on the shoulders of the people least likely to do anything about them. I get the impression that many of Nintendo's followers somehow feel indebted to the company, as if spending their hard-earned cash on the games, consoles, and collectible figurines isn't payment enough. They coerce themselves to give more and more to a company who is only intent on taking. The cycle of exploitation will perpetuate itself until the fans wake up and recognize that they don't owe Nintendo anything, and that a corporation 6,000 miles across the ocean doesn't actually care about them. If you're looking towards Nintendo for salvation, you'd be better off placing that faith anywhere else. Before Nintendo will change the way they treat their fans, the fans must change the way they treat Nintendo. 40 years ago, Nintendo saved the video game industry. Now it's up to Nintendo's fans to save themselves. I'm not asking for people to hate Nintendo. I'm not asking for people to hate the fans. All I'm asking is for everyone to step out of Neverland and to treat Nintendo as just another company.
Which it is.
Come on now, the Wii? People trying to say that the PS3 copied the Wii with the motion sensor. I don't give a fuck. Shit, the Wii, you know what they should copy? They should copy how to get good games.
Oh, what are you doing to me? Oh, Nintendo.